The desert wind carried the scent of rain that would never come. Ayanna crouched behind the red rocks, her dark eyes scanning the horizon where dust clouds rose like angry spirits. She had been tracking the white men for 3 days now, ever since they took her younger brother Keme from their camp near the sacred springs. Her fingers tightened around her bow, carved from the wood of an ancient oak that had survived countless droughts. The leather grip was worn smooth from years of use, stained with the sweat of successful hunts and failed ones alike. Ayanna was known throughout the Apache bands as the finest tracker of her generation, a woman who could read the desert like white men read their books. The riders below moved slowly, their horses tired from the long journey across the unforgiving landscape. There were 6 of them, all wearing the dusty clothes of cattle ranchers. Their leader was a tall man with sandy hair that stuck out from under his worn hat. Even from her hiding place high among the rocks, Ayanna could see the way he sat his horse with confidence, like someone who had spent his entire life in the saddle. This was Jake Morrison, though Ayanna did not know his name yet. She knew only that he was one of the men who had raided their peaceful camp, scattering her people and taking Keme prisoner. The boy was only 15, barely old enough to be considered a warrior, but the white settlers had been taking Apache children to work on their ranches and farms. Ayanna had volunteered to track the raiders when the war council met that evening. The older warriors wanted to gather a large war party and attack with overwhelming force. But Ayanna argued for a different approach. She could move faster alone, and her skills as a hunter would allow her to get close enough to free Keme without alerting the entire group. Now, watching the riders make camp in the valley below, she began to plan her approach. The white men were careless, choosing a spot near a small creek that would mask any sounds she might make. They hobbled their horses but did not post guards, confident that they were safe in this remote part of the territory. As darkness fell, Ayanna made her way down from the rocks. She moved like a shadow, her moccasined feet making no sound on the loose stones. Years of hunting deer and elk in these mountains had taught her to become one with the landscape, to flow around obstacles without disturbing so much as a pebble. The camp was quiet, except for the soft snoring of sleeping men and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. A small fire burned low in the center of their circle, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. Ayanna could see Keme tied to a tree at the edge of the camp, his head hanging down in sleep or despair. She was within 20 feet of her brother when everything went wrong. Jake Morrison sat up suddenly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip with practiced speed. His pale eyes swept the darkness around the camp, and somehow they found her despite the shadows that should have hidden her completely. "Don't move," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I can see you there behind that rock." Ayanna froze, her mind racing. How had he spotted her? She had been completely silent, and her dark clothing blended perfectly with the rocky terrain, unless he had been awake all along, watching and waiting. "Come out slow," Jake continued, rising to his feet but keeping his gun holstered. "I'm not looking for a fight tonight." The other men began to stir at the sound of voices. Ayanna realized she had 2 choices: retreat back into the darkness and try again later, or take her chances now while most of the group was still half asleep. The thought of leaving Keme for another night made the decision for her. She stood and walked into the firelight, her bow held ready but not drawn. Jake Morrison studied her with those pale blue eyes, taking in her deerskin clothing and the long black hair that hung in a single braid down her back. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "You're just a girl." "I am Ayanna of the Chiricahua Apache," she replied in careful English, keeping her voice steady despite the anger that burned in her chest. "You have taken my brother. I have come for him." Jake glanced toward Kim, who had awakened at the sound of voices and was now staring at his sister with wide, frightened eyes. The other men had fully awakened now and were reaching for their weapons, but Jake held up a hand to stop them. "Your brother?" Jake studied the bound boy more carefully, noting the family resemblance in their high cheekbones and proud bearing. "Kid never said he had a sister." "He is young and afraid," Ayanna said. "But he is blood of my blood. You will release him." One of Jake's men, a heavy-set cowboy named Dutch, laughed harshly. "Release him? Girl, that boy tried to steal our horses. We caught him red-handed leading them away from our ranch." Ayanna's dark eyes flashed. "Lies. My brother does not steal. Your people came to our camp while the men hunted. You took him while he gathered water for the elders." "That's not how it happened," Dutch insisted, spitting into the fire where it hissed angrily. "Boy was caught with our stock, plain and simple." Jake studied Ayanna's face in the firelight, seeing the fierce determination there. Something about her story rang true, even though Dutch was one of his most trusted hands. There had been confusion that day when they found the boy with their horses, and in the heat of the moment, maybe they had jumped to conclusions. "Suppose you're right," Jake said slowly. "Suppose there was a misunderstanding. You still came into our camp armed and ready for trouble. That doesn't exactly encourage trust." Ayanna's grip tightened on her bow. "You took my brother from his family. You ride through our lands without permission. You speak to me of trust?" The tension in the camp was thick enough to cut. Jake's men were all awake now, hands resting on their weapons as they waited for orders. Ayanna was outnumbered 6-1, but her stance showed no fear. She was a predator surrounded by prey that happened to have better weapons. "Tell you what," Jake said finally. "Put down that bow and we'll talk about this like civilized people. Maybe we can work something out." "I am not your civilized people," Ayanna replied coldly. "I am Apache. We do not surrender our weapons to enemies." "Then we have a problem," Jake said, his voice hardening slightly. "Because I can't have you standing there ready to put an arrow through one of my men." The standoff stretched for long moments, neither side willing to give ground. Kame watched in growing terror, afraid that his sister's attempt to rescue him would end in bloodshed. The boy had already seen enough violence in his young life. It was Jake who broke the deadlock, doing something that surprised everyone in the camp, including himself. He slowly drew his pistol and placed it on the ground at his feet, then stepped back with his hands raised. "There," he said. "Now we're even. You've got your bow, I've got nothing but my word." Dutch stared at his boss in disbelief. "Jake, what the hell are you doing? She could kill you where you stand." "She could have done that already if she wanted," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off Ayanna. "Could have put an arrow through me before I even knew she was there, but she didn't. That tells me something." Ayanna was equally surprised by the gesture. In all her dealings with white men, she had never seen one voluntarily give up his advantage. Most settlers she had encountered were quick to use their superior weapons and numbers to get their way. "Why do you do this?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of the hostility in her voice. "Because I'm starting to think maybe your brother isn't the horse thief we took him for," Jake admitted. "And because you risked your life to come after him. That kind of loyalty means something to me." He took a step closer, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from his men. "Tell me what really happened. All of it." Ayanna studied his face in the flickering firelight, searching for signs of deception. She had learned to read the expressions of white men during the many negotiations between her people and the territorial authorities. Most of them lied as easily as they breathed, but something in Jake Morrison's pale eyes suggested he might be different. 3 days ago, your riders came to our camp by the sacred springs," she began slowly. "Our warriors were hunting elk in the high country. Only women, children, and elders remained. Your men said they were looking for stolen horses, but they had no proof. They searched our camp, found nothing, but took my brother anyway." "Why him?" Jake asked. Ayanna's jaw tightened. "Because he spoke English, because he was strong enough to work, because you could." Jake felt something twist in his stomach. He had trusted Dutch's account of finding the boy with their horses, but now he was beginning to see another side of the story. Dutch was a good cowhand, but he had little love for the Apache and might have seen an opportunity to acquire free labor. "Dutch," Jake said without turning around, "tell me again exactly how you found the boy." "Jake, you can't seriously be listening to this squaw," Dutch protested. "She'll say anything to get her brother back." "Tell me," Jake repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Dutch shifted uncomfortably. "We were tracking the horses that got stolen from the south pasture. Found the boy leading them away from their camp, like I said." "Leading them where?" Jake pressed. "And why would he be taking them away from his own camp if he stole them? How should I know what goes on in a redskin's mind?" Dutch said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Ayanna stepped forward, her anger blazing like a struck match. "My brother was taking the horses to water. Your animals came to our springs to drink, and he was leading them back to where you camped so they would not be lost. He was helping you, and you repaid him with chains." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the mistake settling on his shoulders. He had built his reputation on being fair and honest in his dealings, but he had let his trust in Dutch override his own judgment. "Untie the boy," he said quietly. Dutch stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Jake, you can't be serious. You're going to take the word of some Apache girl over mine?" "I'm taking the word of someone who risked her life to save her brother over someone who can't keep his story straight," Jake replied, his voice sharp as a knife edge. "Untie him, now!" When Dutch hesitated, Jake picked up his pistol and pointed it at his own hired hand. "I said untie him." The other cowboys exchanged nervous glances but made no move to intervene. They had worked for Jake Morrison long enough to know that when he made a decision, it was final. Dutch cursed under his breath, but walked over to where Keme was bound and began cutting the ropes. Keme stumbled as the bindings fell away, his legs weak from 3 days of being tied. Ayanna rushed to his side, catching him before he could fall. Brother and sister embraced, speaking rapidly in Apache while Jake's men looked on in uncomfortable silence. "There," Jake said, holstering his weapon. "Your brother's free, but I have a question for you." Ayanna looked up from checking Keme for injuries. "What question?" "What happens now? You've got what you came for, but Dutch here isn't going to just forget about this. Neither are his friends. This could turn into a range war if we're not careful." It was a fair point, and Ayanna knew it. Dutch's hatred was written clearly on his face, and she doubted the other cowboys would be any more forgiving. Word would spread that Jake Morrison had sided with an Apache over his own men, and that could bring trouble to both their peoples. "I do not want war," she said finally. "My people have seen enough killing." "Then we need to find another way," Jake said. "Some way to make this right without anyone else getting hurt." Keme spoke up for the first time, his English heavily accented but understandable. "The horses, the ones that were stolen from your ranch. I know where they are." Jake turned to the boy in surprise. "You do?" Keme nodded, though he kept his eyes down. "I saw the men who took them. They were not Apache. They had pale skin like yours, but wore clothes like ours to hide their faces." "White men dressed as Indians," Jake mused. "That's an old trick. Makes it easy to blame the raids on the Apache." "My brother speaks truth," Ayanna added. "We have seen these false Apache before. They steal from both our peoples and let us fight while they escape with the prizes." Jake felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. There had been a rash of thefts in the area over the past few months, always blamed on Apache raids. But the thieves never left tracks that his best trackers could follow, and they seemed to know exactly which ranches to hit and when. "If your brother can lead us to our horses," Jake said slowly, "and if we catch the real thieves, then Dutch and the others will have to admit they were wrong about him." Dutch snorted in disgust. "You're actually going to trust some Indian kid to lead you into the desert? Jake, this is the stupidest thing you've ever done." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But it's also the right thing, and sometimes that's more important than being smart." Ayanna studied the white rancher's face, trying to understand his motivations. Most of his kind cared only about profit and power, but Jake Morrison seemed different. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of her own father, a quality of integrity that could not be faked. "If we do this," she said carefully, "if we help you find your horses, what happens then? Do you promise safe passage for my brother and me?" "You have my word," Jake said solemnly. "Whatever happens, neither of you will be harmed by me or mine." It was not much of a guarantee, considering the hatred she saw in Dutch's eyes, but it was better than the alternative, and if they could expose the real horse thieves, it might prevent future raids on both Apache camps and white settlements. "We will help," Ayanna decided, "but I have conditions." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "We travel together, but my brother and I are not prisoners. We are guides. If we are attacked or betrayed, we will defend ourselves." "Fair enough," Jake agreed, ignoring the angry mutterings from his men. "Anything else?" Ayanna looked around the camp, noting the poor condition of their supplies and the exhausted state of their horses. "You will need food and fresh mounts if you wish to catch the thieves. They have a head start of many days." "We've got supplies back at the ranch," Jake said. "Too far," Keem spoke up. "The thieves move fast. By the time you return to your home and come back, they will be gone." Ayanna nodded in agreement. "But there is another way. My people have a camp 1 day's ride from here. We have horses and food. Chief Running Bear would trade with you if you come in peace." The suggestion sent a murmur of alarm through Jake's men. Riding into an Apache camp was tantamount to suicide in their minds, especially after the confrontation they had just witnessed. "That's crazy talk," Dutch said flatly. "Apaches will fill us full of arrows soon as we show our faces." "Not if we come under my protection," Ayanna replied. "I am daughter of Chief Running Bear. My word carries weight among my people." Jake considered the offer carefully. It was risky, but no more so than trying to chase horse thieves across hundreds of miles of desert with tired mounts and low supplies, and it would be a gesture of trust that might help heal the rift between their peoples. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try it your way." Dutch threw his hat on the ground in disgust. "This is insane, Jake. You're going to get us all killed over some Indian's word." "Then you're free to head back to the ranch," Jake told him coldly. "Take whoever wants to go with you. The rest of us will handle this." But despite their grumbling, none of the cowboys chose to leave. They might not like the plan, but they were loyal to Jake Morrison, and the thought of recovering their stolen horses was appealing enough to overcome their fear. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the unlikely group prepared to break camp. Jake found himself watching Ayanna as she tended to her brother, noting the gentle way she checked his bonds-chafed wrists and the fierce protectiveness in her dark eyes. She was unlike any woman he had ever encountered, white or Indian. Most of the settler women he knew were delicate creatures who needed constant protection from the harsh realities of frontier life. But Ayanna moved through the dangerous desert night like it was her natural habitat, and she had faced down 6 armed men without showing a trace of fear. "You ready for this?" he asked as she finished packing her few belongings. Ayanna looked up at him, and for a moment, he saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. She was taking a huge risk by bringing white men to her people's camp. If things went wrong, she would be blamed for bringing danger to her tribe. "I am ready," she said simply. "The question is whether you are ready to trust an Apache." Jake smiled, and Ayanna was surprised by how the expression transformed his weathered face. "I guess we're about to find out." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the red rock landscape, the small group began their journey toward the Apache camp. Neither Jake nor Ayanna could know that this decision would change both their lives forever, setting in motion events that would test everything they believed about loyalty, justice, and the possibility of understanding between two very different worlds. The desert stretched endlessly before them, holding its secrets close while the wind whispered of challenges yet to come. The Apache camp appeared in the valley below like a mirage shimmering in the afternoon heat. Jake Morrison pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge overlooking the settlement, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took in the sight of dozens of wickiups scattered along the banks of a clear stream. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could see women moving between the dwellings, going about their daily tasks. Children played in the shallow water, their laughter carrying up to where the white men sat their horses in tense silence. It looked peaceful enough, but Jake knew that Apache warriors could be hidden anywhere in the surrounding rocks and trees. "Second thoughts?" Ayanna asked, noting the way his men shifted nervously in their saddles. Jake glanced at her, seeing the challenge in her dark eyes. She had ridden beside him for the entire day, matching his pace across the rough terrain without complaint. Her brother, Kemi, had proven equally tough despite his ordeal as a prisoner. "No second thoughts," Jake replied, though his mouth was dry as dust. "Lead the way." Dutch muttered something under his breath that was probably a prayer, while the other cowboys checked their weapons one more time. They were committed now, whether they liked it or not. As they descended into the valley, Jake noticed how the normal sounds of the camp gradually faded. Women gathered their children and disappeared into the wickiups, while old men emerged to watch the approaching riders with suspicious eyes. By the time they reached the edge of the settlement, the only sounds were their horses' hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Then the warriors appeared. They seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, rising from behind rocks and stepping out from behind trees. Within moments, the small group of white men found themselves surrounded by 24 Apache fighters, all armed with bows, lances, and a few old rifles. Jake forced himself to keep his hands visible and away from his weapons, though every instinct screamed at him to draw his gun. Beside him, Dutch was pale as fresh snow, and the other cowboys looked ready to bolt. "Easy," Jake said quietly to his men. "Nobody moves unless I say so." An older Apache warrior stepped forward, his weathered face stern as granite. He wore traditional buckskin leggings and a calico shirt, with a red headband holding back his graying hair. The man's dark eyes fixed on Jake with unmistakable hostility. "Father," Ayanna said, sliding down from her horse, "these men come in peace. They seek justice for wrongs done to both our peoples." So this was Chief Running Bear, Jake realized. The resemblance to Ayanna was clear in the proud bearing and intelligent eyes, though the chief's face was marked by years of warfare and hardship. Running Bear spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone sharp with anger. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. The chief was not pleased to see white men in his camp, even under his daughter's protection. Ayanna replied in the same language, gesturing toward Jake and then toward Keem. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding their voices to the discussion. Jake sat quietly, knowing that his life and the lives of his men hung in the balance. Finally, Running Bear switched to heavily accented English. "My daughter says you are different from other white eyes. She says you freed my son when you learned the truth of his capture. This is so?" "It is," Jake confirmed. dismounting slowly and keeping his hands visible. "We made a mistake. I'm trying to make it right." The chief studied him for a long moment, then looked past him to where Dutch and the others still sat their horses. "And these men, do they also seek justice?" Jake glanced back at his cowboys, noting the fear and anger in their faces. Dutch, in particular, looked ready to start shooting at any moment. "They follow my orders," Jake said simply. "I've given my word that we come in peace." Running Bear nodded slowly. "Words are like wind, easily broken, but my daughter's life speaks for you. She would not bring danger to her people without good cause." The chief gestured, and several warriors stepped back to create a path through their ranks. "You may dismount. Your weapons will be taken while you remain in our camp." Dutch started to protest, but Jake cut him off with a sharp look. "Do it," he ordered. "All of you. Hand over your guns." The cowboys reluctantly surrendered their weapons to the Apache warriors, who handled the firearms with obvious familiarity. Jake noticed that many of the warriors carried modern rifles alongside their traditional bows, evidence of trading or raiding success. "Now," Running Bear said, "we will hear this story of horse thieves and false Apache." A large fire was built in the center of the camp, and the entire tribe gathered around it as the sun began to set behind the western mountains. Jake found himself seated on a blanket across the fire from the chief, with Ayanna and Kime beside their father. The firelight danced across dozens of faces, young and old, all watching him with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, while warriors stood ready to act at the first sign of treachery. Jake told his story carefully, explaining how horses had been stolen from his ranch and how they had wrongly accused Keem of the theft. He described the pattern of raids that had plagued the territory, always blamed on Apache but never leaving clear tracks. Kame translated his words into Apache for those who didn't speak English, and Jake could see the crowd's reaction to his tale. There were nods of understanding and angry mutters about the false accusations. When Jake finished, Running Bear turned to his son. "Tell us what you saw, my son. Speak of these pale men who dress as Apache." Cam rose to his feet, and Jake was struck by the dignity in the boy's bearing despite his youth. This was a culture that respected courage and honesty, regardless of age. "3 days before the white men took me," Cam began, "I was hunting rabbits in the canyon north of here. I heard horses and hid among the rocks to see who passed." The boy's English was halting, but clear as he described seeing a group of 6 riders dressed in Apache clothing, but riding like white men. They had been driving a small herd of horses toward the Badlands where few people ever traveled. "I followed at a distance," Keme continued. "They stopped at the old silver mine, the one the Spanish dug long ago. There were more horses there, and white men without the Apache clothes. They spoke of raids on ranches and how easy it was to make the Apache take the blame." Running Bear's face was grim as he listened to his son's account. "You should have come back immediately to tell us of this." "I wanted to see more," Kame admitted. "I thought if I could learn where they hid the horses, it would help our people. But I was seen. They chased me, but I escaped on foot through the rocks." Jake leaned forward intently. "The old silver mine. How far from here?" 2 days' hard ride," Running Bear answered. "The Spanish worked it for silver many years ago, but it played out. Now it is home only to bats and rattlesnakes. Perfect place to hide stolen livestock," Jake mused. "Remote, hard to reach, plenty of water from the mine springs." An older warrior spoke up, his voice harsh with anger. "These false Apache bring shame on our people. They make the white eyes think all Apache are thieves and killers." Others voiced their agreement, and Jake could see the genuine outrage in their faces. The Apache might be fierce fighters, but they had their own code of honor. Being blamed for crimes they didn't commit was an insult they wouldn't tolerate. "What do you propose?" Running Bear asked Jake directly. Jake had been thinking about that question all day. "We go to the mine together. Your warriors and my men. We catch these thieves in the act and expose them for what they are. And then, the chief pressed, then we take them to the territorial governor. Let them face justice in the white man's court. When people see that Apache and white men work together to stop the real criminals, maybe some of the hatred will end. It was an idealistic plan, and Jake knew it. But it was also their best chance to prevent the escalating violence that threatened to engulf the entire territory. Running Bear spoke to his warriors in Apache, and a heated debate began. Some argued for simply killing the horse thieves and being done with it, while others wanted to avoid any contact with white law enforcement. The discussion went on for nearly an hour, with voices raised in passion on all sides. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence. "We will do this thing," he announced. "But there will be conditions." "Name them," Jake said. "First, Apache justice will be served alongside white justice. These men have brought shame on our people. We will have our own reckoning." Jake nodded. He didn't like the sound of that, but he understood the Apache need for satisfaction. "Second," Running Bear continued, "if this is a trap, if you lead us into ambush, you and your men will not leave this valley alive." "Understood," Jake replied, meeting the chief's steady gaze. "Third, when this is finished, you will speak for the Apache to your people. You will tell them that we are not the enemies they believe us to be." That was asking a lot, Jake realized. Speaking up for the Apache could cost him friends and business relationships. But looking around the fire at the faces of these people, he found himself nodding agreement. "I'll tell them," he promised. Running Bear smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. "Good. Now let us plan this raid." The next hour was spent working out the details of their attack on the mine. Maps were drawn in the dirt with sticks, showing the layout of the abandoned workings and the best approaches. Apache scouts who knew the area well described the terrain and possible escape routes. Jake was impressed by the tactical knowledge of the Apache warriors. These were men who had been fighting a guerrilla war against overwhelming odds for years, and their expertise showed. They thought like soldiers, not just raiders. As the planning session broke up, Jake found himself walking with Ayanna toward the stream, where their horses were picketed for the night. The camp was settling into evening routines, with families gathering around smaller fires for their evening meals. "Your people are not what I expected," Jake admitted as they walked. "What did you expect?" Ayanna asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the stories he had heard all his life, tales of savage raids and brutal torture, of Apache warriors who showed no mercy to their enemies. "I don't know," he said finally. "Something different than this. Your father is a wise man. Your brother is brave beyond his years. And you," he trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. "And me?" Ayanna prompted. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. In the moonlight, with her long black hair loose around her shoulders, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. "You're like no woman I've ever known," he said honestly, "Apache or otherwise." Something flickered in Ayanna's dark eyes, an emotion Jake couldn't quite read. For a moment he thought she might say something, but then she looked away toward the distant mountains. "Tomorrow will be dangerous," she said, changing the subject. "These horse thieves will not surrender easily." "Are you coming with us?" Jake asked. "Of course. Those men have brought dishonor on my people. I have as much right to face them as anyone." Jake wanted to protest, to tell her it was too dangerous for a woman to ride into battle. But he had already seen proof of her courage and skill. She had tracked his men across miles of desert and infiltrated their camp without being detected. Ayanna was as capable as any warrior. "Just be careful," he said instead. She turned back to him with a slight smile. "Are you worried about me, Jake Morrison?" It was the first time she had used his name, and hearing it in her voice sent an unexpected thrill through him. "Maybe I am," he admitted. They stood there in the moonlight, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Jake found himself thinking thoughts that had no place in his practical cowboy mind, imagining a world where Apache and White could be more than just uneasy allies. But that world seemed as distant as the stars overhead, and tomorrow's dangers were all too real. "Get some rest," Ayanna said softly. "Dawn comes early and we have a long ride ahead." Jake nodded and turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Jake?" He looked back at her, noting how the moonlight seemed to glow in her dark hair. "Thank you," she said simply, "for freeing Kime, for believing our story, for treating us like people instead of enemies." "Thank you for giving me the chance," Jake replied. As he walked back toward where his men were bedded down for the night, Jake reflected on how much had changed in just one day. This morning, he had been a simple rancher chasing horse thieves. Tonight, he was allied with Apache warriors and planning a joint raid that could reshape relations between their peoples. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he had met a woman who challenged everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and the possibilities for understanding between different worlds. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass along the stream bank. Jake woke to the sound of horses moving and men speaking in low voices. The Apache were already preparing for the journey, checking weapons and supplies with the efficiency of experienced warriors. His own men were slower to wake, still uncomfortable in their strange surroundings. Dutch, in particular, seemed on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound. "You sure about this, boss?" Dutch asked as they saddled their horses. "Riding with a bunch of Apaches into God knows what kind of trap?" "It's not a trap," Jake said firmly. "These people have as much to lose as we do." But privately, he wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. In a few hours, they would be riding into unknown territory to face an unknown number of desperate men. If things went wrong, none of them might make it back alive. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert rocks in shades of gold and red, the combined force of Apache warriors and white cowboys prepared to depart. It was an unlikely alliance, forged by necessity and held together by hope. Jake mounted his horse and looked around at the faces of the men and women who would ride with him into danger. Apache and White, they were united now by a common cause, but he knew that unity was fragile as morning frost. Everything would depend on what they found at the old silver mine, and whether justice could truly bridge the gap between two worlds that had been at war for so long. The old silver mine sat in a narrow canyon, like a wound cut into the red rock walls. Jake Morrison crouched beside Ayanna on a ridge overlooking the abandoned workings, studying the scene below through his field glasses. After 2 days of hard riding across some of the most unforgiving country he had ever seen, they had finally found their quarry. "Count 20 horses in the main corral," he whispered, passing the glasses to Ayanna. "And I can see at least 4 men moving around down there." Ayanna peered through the lenses, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the thieves' camp. The old Spanish mine workings provided excellent cover, with tumbled stone buildings and mine shafts offering dozens of hiding places. A natural spring provided water, and the narrow canyon made the location easy to defend. "There are more men than that," she said quietly. "See the smoke from behind those rocks? 2 more cooking fires at least. And watch the shadows near the mine entrance." Jake looked where she pointed and caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness of the main shaft. She was right. There were probably 8 or 10 men down there, all armed and dangerous. Behind them, on the back slope of the ridge, the combined force of Apache warriors and Jake's cowboys waited for word. It was an uneasy alliance, with the 2 groups keeping their distance from each other despite their common purpose. Only the mutual respect for Jake and Running Bear kept them working together. "What do you think?" Jake asked Ayanna. She studied the layout below for a few more moments, noting the guard positions and escape routes. "They are confident. Too confident. Only one man watching the canyon mouth, and he is more interested in his breakfast than his duties." Jake had noticed the same thing. After months of successful raids with no pursuit, the horse thieves had grown careless. They probably figured they were safe in their remote hideout, with the blame for their crimes falling on the Apache. "Your father's plan will work," Jake said. "Hit them from 3 sides at once, before they can get organized." Ayanna nodded, but he could see the tension in her face. In a few minutes, people would start shooting, and some of them might not survive. She had killed before while hunting and in defense of her people, but this felt different somehow. "Second thoughts?" Jake asked, echoing her own words from 2 days earlier. "No," she replied firmly. "These men have brought dishonor on my people and stolen from yours. They must face justice." Jake reached out and briefly touched her hand. "Stay safe down there. I don't want to have to explain to your father how I got his daughter killed." She gave him a quick smile. "I can take care of myself, Jake Morrison. But I will be careful." They made their way back down the ridge to where the others waited. Running Bear had positioned his warriors to attack from the north and south, while Jake's men would block the canyon mouth to prevent escape. It was a good plan, but plans had a way of falling apart once the shooting started. "Remember," Jake told his cowboys, "we want these men alive if possible. Dead horse thieves can't confess to their crimes or clear the Apache of blame." Dutch spat into the dust. "They start shooting at us. I'm not going to worry too much about taking them alive." "Just follow orders," Jake said sharply. He was beginning to regret bringing Dutch along, but it was too late for second thoughts now. Running Bear spoke briefly to his warriors in Apache, then turned to Jake. "We will be in position when the sun touches that rock," he said, pointing to a distinctive formation on the canyon wall. "When you hear the war cry, the attack begins." Jake nodded and shook the older man's hand. "Good hunting, Chief. And to you, my friend." The combined force split up, with the Apache melting into the rocks and brush like ghosts. Jake led his men down a winding game trail toward the canyon mouth, keeping low to avoid being seen by the careless sentry. The minutes crawled by like hours as they waited for the signal. Jake checked and rechecked his weapons, while his men fidgeted nervously in their concealed positions. The sun seemed frozen in the sky, but finally it crept to the designated mark on the canyon wall. The Apache war cry that split the morning air was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. It started as a single voice, high and wild, then was picked up by other throats until it echoed off the canyon walls like the howl of hunting wolves. The effect on the horse thieves was immediate and dramatic. Men came running from all directions, some only half-dressed, others clutching rifles and pistols. The careful organization of their camp dissolved into chaos as they tried to figure out where the attack was coming from. "Apache!" someone screamed from near the mine entrance. "We're under attack!" Jake and his men charged down into the canyon mouth, cutting off the main escape route. The first horse thief to reach them was a bearded man carrying an old Spencer rifle. He skidded to a stop when he saw Jake's gun pointed at his chest. "Drop it!" Jake commanded, but the man was too panicked to listen. The Spencer came up, and Jake had no choice but to fire. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the rifle flying. He hit the ground hard, but was still alive. All around the canyon, gunfire erupted as the hidden Apache warriors opened up on the confused thieves. Jake saw Ayanna rise from behind a boulder, her bow drawn and ready. She released an arrow that took down a man trying to reach his horse, the shaft sinking deep into his thigh. The battle was brief, but intense. Caught off guard and surrounded, the horse thieves put up a desperate fight, but were hopelessly outnumbered. Within 10 minutes, it was over. 6 men lay dead or wounded while 4 others had thrown down their weapons in surrender. Jake walked through the camp with Running Bear, surveying the evidence of the thieves' crimes. Besides the horses stolen from his ranch, they found animals bearing brands from at least a dozen other spreads across the territory. There were also Apache clothing and war paint, clear proof of how the thieves had disguised themselves for their raids. "This should be enough to convince even the most stubborn territorial officials," Jake said, picking up a fake Apache headdress. "Perhaps," Running Bear replied, but his tone was skeptical. "White man's justice is often blind when it looks upon Apache." One of the surviving thieves, a thin man with a weak chin and nervous eyes, was brought before them. His name was Charlie Weeks, and he had been shot in the leg but was still able to talk. "You got no right to attack us like this," he whined. "We was just minding our own business." Jake gestured at the corrals full of stolen horses. "Minding your business? These animals belong to ranchers all over the territory." "You can't prove nothing," Weeks replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. Running Bear stepped closer to the wounded man, and Weeks shrank back in fear. The Apache chief's presence was intimidating even when he wasn't angry, and right now his dark eyes blazed with righteous fury. "This man will speak the truth," Running Bear said calmly, "or he will find Apache justice less forgiving than white man's law." The threat in the chief's voice was unmistakable, and Weeks cracked immediately. The whole story poured out of him in a rush of words. How they had been stealing horses for months, disguising themselves as Apache to avoid suspicion. How they had laughed about the blame falling on innocent Indians, while they made money selling stolen stock to dishonest dealers in Mexico. "It wasn't my idea," Weeks protested. "Bill Cartwright, he's the one who thought it up, said the Apache would take the blame and nobody would care enough to investigate too hard." Jake looked around for this Cartwright but didn't see him among the dead or captured. "Where is he now?" "Rode out yesterday with a herd of prime stock," Weeks admitted. "Heading for the border. Should be back in a week or so." It was frustrating to learn that the ringleader had escaped, but they had enough evidence to expose the entire operation. The territorial governor would have to take notice when faced with this much proof, especially with Apache and white testimony backing it up. As they prepared to leave the canyon with their prisoners and recovered horses, Jake found himself walking beside Ayanna again. She had performed well in the fight, showing the same courage and skill he had come to expect from her. "Your brother was right about this place," he told her. "We never would have found it without his information." "Kame is young, but he sees clearly," Ayanna replied. "He will make a fine warrior someday." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, leading the long string of recovered horses back toward civilization. Around them, Apache warriors and white cowboys worked together to manage the herd, their earlier suspicions forgotten in the satisfaction of a successful mission. But Jake knew this cooperation was fragile. Once they reached town and the excitement wore off, old prejudices would reassert themselves. The Apache would return to their reservation, and his cowboys would go back to viewing all Indians as potential enemies. "What happens now?" he asked Ayanna, voicing his own doubts. "Now we see if justice truly exists in the white man's world," she replied, "or if this was all for nothing." The territorial capital of Tucson was bustling with activity when their unusual procession rode down the main street 3 days later. People stopped and stared at the sight of Apache warriors riding peacefully alongside white cowboys, herding stolen horses and guarding bound prisoners. Word of their mission had preceded them, and a crowd gathered outside the territorial courthouse as Jake and Running Bear dismounted. The governor himself came out to meet them, flanked by clerks and territorial marshals. Governor Samuel Mitchell was a political man who understood the importance of appearances. The sight of Apache and white working together was too good a public relations opportunity to waste, especially with territorial statehood being debated in Washington. "Gentlemen," he said warmly, shaking hands with both Jake and Running Bear. "I understand you've accomplished something remarkable here." The next hour was spent in the governor's office, with Weeks and the other prisoners confessing their crimes in detail. The evidence was overwhelming, from the stolen horses to the Apache disguises to the testimony of multiple witnesses. "This is excellent work," Governor Mitchell said when the formal statements were complete. "These criminals will face the full penalty of the law, and their confessions will be published in every newspaper in the territory." Jake felt a surge of satisfaction, but Running Bear remained skeptical. "And what of the Apache who have been wrongly accused?" he asked. "What of the raids that were blamed on my people?" "Full pardons will be issued," the governor assured him, "and I'll personally ensure that these facts are widely known. Your people have been grievously wronged, Chief, and the territory owes you an apology." It was more than Jake had dared hope for, but he could see that Ayanna was still not entirely convinced. She had lived too long with white promises that were quickly broken when political winds shifted. As they prepared to leave Tucson, Jake realized that his time with the Apache was coming to an end. The mission was complete. Justice had been served, and now everyone would return to their separate worlds. He found Ayanna tending to her horse outside the hotel where they had spent the night. She looked beautiful in the afternoon sunlight, but there was a sadness in her dark eyes that matched his own mood. "So this is goodbye," he said, not really making it a question. "My people must return to the reservation," she replied without looking up from her work. "And you must return to your ranch." Jake wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gulf that was opening between them again. But what could he offer her? His world had no place for an Apache woman, just as her world had no place for a white rancher. "I meant what I told your father," he said finally. "I'll speak for your people whenever I can. I'll tell everyone who will listen about what really happened here." Ayanna finally looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. "I know you will. You are a man of honor, Jake Morrison." They stood there looking at each other, both knowing that this might be their last moment alone together. Jake reached out and gently touched her face, marveling at the softness of her skin. "In another time, another place," he began. "But not in this time or this place," she finished sadly. Jake nodded, accepting the bitter truth of her words. The gulf between their worlds was still too wide to bridge, no matter how much they might wish it otherwise. As the Apache prepared to depart, Running Bear approached Jake one final time. "You have proven yourself a friend to our people," the chief said formally. "This will not be forgotten." "Nor will your friendship," Jake replied, shaking the older man's hand. He watched as the Apache warriors mounted their horses and formed up for the journey back to their homeland. Ayanna swung gracefully onto her pony, but she didn't look back as the group began to move. Jake stood in the dusty street until they disappeared from sight, then slowly turned to gather his own men for the trip back to his ranch. The adventure was over. The criminals had been caught, and justice had been served. But somehow, it felt more like an ending than a victory. 3 months later, Jake was working cattle in his south pasture when one of his hands came riding up fast. The man's face was flushed with excitement, and he could barely get his words out. "Boss," the cowboy gasped, "you got visitors up at the house. Apache visitors." Jake's heart leapt, and he spurred his horse toward the ranch house without another word. Could it be Ayanna? Had something changed that brought her back into his world? But as he rode into the yard, he saw that it was Running Bear and Keme who waited for him, along with 2 other warriors he didn't recognize. There was no sign of Ayanna, and Jake felt his hopes crashing down. "Chief," he said, dismounting and walking over to greet them. "This is an honor. What brings you to my ranch?" Running Bear's weathered face was serious as he clasped Jake's hand. I bring news from our agent at the reservation. Word has come from Washington. The territorial governor has been replaced by a new man, one who does not believe in Apache innocence. Jake felt his stomach sink. Political winds shifted quickly in territorial politics, and reformers like Governor Mitchell were often replaced by men with different priorities. "What does that mean?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It means the pardons have been revoked," Running Bear said heavily. "The new governor claims there was never sufficient evidence to clear Apache of the horse-stealing charges. He says we are still wanted for crimes we did not commit." The injustice of it made Jake's blood boil. "But the confessions, the evidence, the testimony—" "All dismissed as unreliable," Cam spoke up, his young face hard with anger. "The new governor says white criminals will say anything to save themselves, and Apache testimony is worthless." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of failure settling on his shoulders. All their work, all the risks they had taken, all the hope for justice between their peoples had been swept away by political expediency. "There's more," Running Bear continued. "Warrants have been issued for the arrest of all Apache who participated in the raid on the mine, including my daughter." "Ayanna?" Jake's head snapped up. "They want to arrest Ayanna?" "She is accused of leading a war party against white citizens," Running Bear explained. "The new governor has declared all Apache involved to be hostile and has authorized the cavalry to bring us in dead or alive." Jake felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. The woman who had risked her life to help catch the real criminals was now being hunted as a criminal herself. It was beyond unjust. It was evil. "Where is she now?" he asked. Running Bear hesitated. "She has gone into the high country, to the sacred places where the cavalry cannot follow. But she cannot hide forever, and the soldiers grow bolder each day." "What can I do?" Jake asked immediately. "How can I help?" The old chief studied him for a long moment, seeing something in Jake's eyes that confirmed what he had long suspected. "There is a way," he said slowly. "But it would require great sacrifice from you." "Name it." "My daughter could claim sanctuary in the white world if she were married to a white man," Running Bear explained. "The law would protect her as the wife of a citizen." Jake's heart began to race. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting that you think carefully about what such a marriage would cost you," Running Bear said seriously. "Your neighbors would not accept an Apache wife. Your business would suffer. You would be an outcast among your own people." Jake didn't hesitate. "I don't care about any of that. The question is whether Ayanna would accept such an arrangement." Running Bear smiled for the first time since arriving. "Why don't you ask her yourself?" "She is waiting in the rocks above the north pasture." Jake looked in the direction the chief indicated and saw a familiar figure silhouetted against the sky. Even at a distance, he could recognize Ayanna's proud bearing and graceful movements. "Go to her," Running Bear urged. "Speak from your heart, and she will listen." Jake mounted his horse and rode toward the rocks where Ayanna waited. His heart was pounding and his mouth was dry, but his resolve was absolute. He had lost her once to the realities of their different worlds. He would not lose her again to the injustice of men who cared nothing for truth or honor. As he reached the base of the rocky outcrop, Ayanna appeared on a ledge above him. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, her dark hair flowing free in the wind and her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You should not have come," she called down to him. "It is dangerous for you to be seen with me now." "I don't care about the danger," Jake replied, dismounting and beginning to climb toward her. "I care about you." When he reached the ledge, they stood facing each other across a distance of only a few feet, but it felt like miles. Ayanna's face was a mask of carefully controlled emotion, but he could see the turmoil in her dark eyes. "Your father told me about the new warrants," Jake said. "About the new governor." "Then you know why I cannot stay," Ayanna replied. I will not bring danger to my family or to you." "What if there was another way?" Jake asked. "What if you didn't have to run or hide?" Hope flickered in her eyes, but she quickly suppressed it. "There is no other way." "The white man's law has spoken." "The white man's law also recognizes marriage," Jake said, stepping closer to her. "A wife cannot be held responsible for the actions she took before her marriage, especially if those actions were justified." Ayanna stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Morrison?" "I'm asking you to let me protect you the only way I can," Jake replied. "But I'm also asking because I love you, Ayanna. I've loved you since that first night when you walked into my camp ready to fight 6 armed men for your brother." Tears spilled down Ayanna's cheeks as she struggled with the decision. "You would lose everything. Your friends, your place in white society, your business." "I'd lose more if I let you disappear into the mountains," Jake said firmly. "None of that other stuff matters if you're not in my life." Ayanna looked out across the vast landscape toward the distant mountains where her people made their home. Then she looked back at Jake, seeing the love and determination in his pale eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "I will marry you." Jake stepped forward and took her in his arms, holding her close as they both wept with relief and joy. They had found each other across the gulf between 2 worlds, and no amount of prejudice or political maneuvering would separate them again. The wedding took place 3 days later in the parlor of Jake's ranch house, performed by a circuit judge who owed Jake enough favors to overlook the unusual nature of the ceremony. Running Bear gave away his daughter with dignity and pride, while Kime stood as witness alongside Jake's few remaining loyal hands. It was a small ceremony, but it was enough to make their union legal in the eyes of the territorial government. As Jake slipped a simple gold band onto Ayanna's finger, he knew that they faced an uncertain future filled with challenges and prejudice. But they would face it together, as husband and wife, as partners in a love that had bridged 2 worlds and proven that understanding and acceptance were possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. Years later, when the territory achieved statehood and the bitter conflicts between Apache and white began to heal, their marriage would be remembered as a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over hatred, understanding over ignorance. But on that day, as they stood together in the fading light of the Arizona sunset, Jake and Ayanna Morrison simply held each other close and dreamed of the life they would build together, one day at a time.